What if I told you that if Canada shut its borders today, entire US states would be thrown into chaos? Imagine sudden blackouts sweeping across cities, empty grocery shelves where once was plenty, and factories grinding to a halt. It sounds like a nightmare scenario, but for some American states, this dependency on Canada isn't hypothetical. It's their everyday reality. These aren't just friendly neighbors sharing a border, they're economic lifelines. Trade routes, energy pipelines, shared natural resources, and a complex web of industries tie these states tightly to Canada's economy. And in 2025, these connections have only grown stronger, making the risks of disruption even more critical. Whether it's cars being assembled with parts crossing the border multiple times, or entire power grids relying on Canadian hydroelectricity, the US-Canada relationship runs deep, often deeper than most Americans realize. And if those ties were suddenly cut, the fallout would be felt not just in dollars, but in daily life. So today, we're going to explore the 10 US states that depend on Canada more than any other. From the heartland to the coasts, from energy to agriculture, these states have built their futures hand in hand with Canada. Stay with us, because the state that tops this list might surprise you, and it will definitely change how you look at our northern neighbor forever. Number 10. Washington. What happens when two innovation hubs straddle a border? You get Washington and British Columbia, a cross-border alliance that's become a model for 21st century economic integration. Washington State and Canada are more than trade partners. They're collaborators in technology, energy, environment, and infrastructure. The Seattle-Vancouver corridor has quietly become one of North America's most dynamic economic regions. Let's break it down. Small diamond first, the tech connection. Major companies in Seattle, like Microsoft, Amazon, and even smaller startups, actively collaborate and share talent with firms in Vancouver. It's not uncommon to see cross-border teams developing software, managing AI systems, and building cloud platforms that serve millions across the continent. Vancouver acts as a soft extension of Seattle's booming tech ecosystem. Small diamond, then there's the Pacific Trade Gateway. Washington's ports, especially those in Seattle and Tacoma, are major export and import hubs for goods bound for Canada and beyond. These ports work hand in hand with British Columbia's ports in Vancouver and Prince Rupert, forming a powerful logistics chain for goods flowing to and from Asia. Disruption on either side would slow down billions in international trade. Small diamond, and don't forget the environment. Washington and British Columbia share ecosystems, forests, rivers, salmon migration routes, and even the air. That's why they've signed bilateral agreements on forest fire prevention, climate change response, and clean energy cooperation. When wildfires rage in BC, Washington feels the smoke. When salmon disappear upstream, both sides lose. And the numbers: over $13 billion in annual trade flows between Washington State and Canada. And that figure is only climbing. If Canada ever hit pause on trade or cooperation, due to political tension or economic strategy, Washington wouldn't just feel it in their balance sheets. It would ripple through their tech sector, supply chains, environmental protections, and even their energy grid. Washington isn't just a US state. It's part of a larger Pacific Northwest ecosystem that thrives because of its deep, active relationship with Canada. Number 9. Vermont. Don't let its size fool you. Vermont may be one of the smallest US states, but its economic heartbeat is deeply tied to Canada, especially its northern neighbor, Quebec. This isn't just a neighborly relationship. This is survival-level interdependence, particularly for Vermont's rural communities. Small diamond. Let's start with energy. Over 60% of Vermont's electricity comes directly from Hydro-Quebec, a vast hydroelectric system in Canada. That clean, renewable energy doesn't just power Vermont's homes and businesses, it helps the state meet its climate goals. If that power was suddenly cut off, Vermont would face serious energy shortfalls, potentially triggering blackouts or skyrocketing energy prices. Small diamond. Then there's dairy, the backbone of Vermont's agriculture. Vermont is famous for its small family farms, many of which rely on a tightly regulated trade flow with Canada. The US and Canada both operate under complex supply management systems, and disruptions in cross-border dairy agreements could spell disaster for Vermont's farmers. In fact, many dairy products produced in Vermont either go to Canada or compete with Canadian imports right next door. Small diamond. And let's not forget tourism and real estate. Thousands of Canadians own vacation homes in Vermont, and pre-pandemic, cross-border traffic was constant. Tourists from Quebec come for skiing, fall foliage, maple syrup, you name it. Local businesses, inns, restaurants, tour guides, depend on that seasonal Canadian influx. If the border closes, those dollars vanish, and rural towns feel the hit almost overnight. This relationship is more than just trade and tourism, it's cultural. Vermont and Quebec share festivals, family ties, and even linguistic overlaps in border communities. There's a quiet integration that most Americans never hear about. The bottom line, without Canada, Vermont would face an energy crisis, a tourism drought, and a major blow to its dairy industry. The state may be rural and peaceful, but its economic future is anything but isolated. Number 8. Pennsylvania. You might not think of Pennsylvania when you hear about Canada-US partnerships, but behind the scenes, Pennsylvania is a silent powerhouse in the US-Canada energy and trade network. Let's break it down. Small diamond first, natural gas. Pennsylvania is one of the top producers of natural gas in the United States, thanks to the massive Marcellus Shale formation. But did you know that natural gas flows in both directions across the US-Canada border? Through a network of pipelines, Pennsylvania sends gas north to power Canadian industries, and in return, Canadian energy companies invest heavily in infrastructure and supply security in the region. If that flow stopped tomorrow, not only would energy prices spike, but entire contracts could collapse, impacting utility companies and consumers alike. Small diamond. Then there's steel and aluminum. Pennsylvania's manufacturing and construction sectors rely on Canadian raw materials to stay competitive. From car parts in Pittsburgh to skyscraper frames in Philadelphia, the demand for high-quality Canadian steel and aluminum is constant. These materials aren't just convenient, they're critical. Disruptions in Canadian imports would force businesses to source costlier or lower-quality alternatives, hitting profit margins hard and threatening jobs. Small diamond. And don't overlook Philadelphia's ports. These ports are more than just a local hub. They're a vital gateway for Canadian freight, handling everything from food and machinery to chemicals and consumer goods. Millions of dollars worth of trade moves through Pennsylvania's ports annually, and a surprising portion of that revenue is directly tied to cross-border commerce with Canada. If that trade were blocked or slowed, it would ripple across the state's logistics and warehouse industries, which employ tens of thousands of people. Pennsylvania may not share a border with Canada, but its economic arteries run straight north. From energy and raw materials to ports and infrastructure, the Keystone State is deeply connected to Canada in ways most people never realize. Lose Canada, and Pennsylvania doesn't just lose a trading partner, it loses a key driver of its industrial backbone. Number 7. Ohio. Ohio may be in the heart of America, but its economy pulses with Canadian support. With over $15 billion in annual trade between Ohio and Canada, the Buckeye State depends on its northern neighbor for far more than people realize. From steel and auto parts to plastics and industrial machinery, Canadian goods flow into Ohio to support its powerful manufacturing base. What makes this partnership essential is the just-in-time logistics system, cross-border deliveries that keep Ohio's factories moving without expensive stockpiles. A delay at the border, that could mean production stops in cities like Toledo and Cleveland. On top of trade, Canadian companies are investing in Ohio's future, especially in green energy and clean tech manufacturing. These joint efforts are helping Ohio transition from its Rust Belt legacy to a more sustainable and innovation-driven economy. In short, Ohio's economic revival is closely tied to Canada. Disrupt that, and the impact would be felt in everything from jobs to energy to industrial growth. Number 6. Maine. Maine, known for its rugged coastline, lighthouses, and forests, might seem like one of the most self-sufficient states in America. But behind that rustic charm lies a quiet and powerful dependency on its neighbor to the north, Canada. Let's start with electricity. Maine imports up to 80% of its power from Canada, primarily from Hydro-Quebec. This isn't just a matter of convenience, it's about survival, especially in the harsh winters when temperatures can drop well below freezing. If Canada were to halt electricity exports, entire rural areas could go dark, homes could lose heat, and essential services could come to a standstill. The state's power grid is tightly interwoven with Canadian infrastructure, and Maine's energy security is, in many ways, a Canadian guarantee. But energy is just one part of the equation. Maine's economy relies heavily on forest products, from paper mills to lumber yards. Canadian softwood lumber and pulp supplement domestic resources, supporting thousands of jobs. This cross-border trade isn't just helpful, it's foundational. Without it, many mills would slow down or shut entirely, disrupting local economies that are already vulnerable. The labor force tells another story. Maine's population is aging, and its rural areas are seeing population decline. Into this gap step Canadian seasonal and cross-border workers. They help with everything from agriculture and tourism to logging and trucking. During peak seasons, parts of Maine's economy would grind to a halt without this influx of labor. Canadian workers aren't just guests, they're essential personnel. Tourism, too, has a northern flavor. Visitors from New Brunswick and Quebec are a lifeline for local businesses in towns like Bar Harbor and Presque Isle. From summer vacations to cross-border shopping and festivals, Canadians inject millions into Maine's hospitality sector. A closed border would mean more than quiet streets. It would mean financial distress for countless small business owners. And let's not forget environmental management. Maine and the Canadian provinces share watersheds, forests, and migratory wildlife. There are joint environmental agreements and coordinated emergency response protocols. Climate change, forest fires, and flooding don't respect borders, and neither do the solutions. So while Maine might wear the look of independence, its functioning is deeply entwined with Canada. Flip a few switches: energy, trade, labor, tourism, and the state would feel the effects almost immediately. In 2025, this quiet dependency is more critical than ever. Number 5. Illinois. Illinois might be home to Chicago, a towering financial and commercial powerhouse, but even giants need allies. And for Illinois, that ally is Canada. Let's start with the numbers. Canada is Illinois' #1 trading partner, with over $17 billion in goods and services exchanged every year. This isn't just international trade, this is daily economic survival. Thousands of businesses in Illinois rely on Canadian raw materials, machinery, chemicals, and agricultural imports to keep operations moving. From farm equipment in rural Illinois to aerospace parts in Chicago's suburbs, Canadian supply chains feed Illinois innovation. But the connection goes far deeper than trade figures. At the heart of Illinois infrastructure is its rail network, and Canadian companies play a massive role. The Canadian National Railway, CN, and Canadian Pacific Kansas City, CPKC, run directly through the state, making Chicago the single most important freight hub in North America. Every day, thousands of rail cars loaded with goods from Canada pass through Illinois, connecting Canadian resources to American factories, and vice versa. This isn't just traffic, it's the circulatory system of Midwest commerce. Without Canadian railways operating seamlessly across the US border, Illinois' supply chain would face massive disruptions. From steel to grain to consumer goods, nearly every major Illinois industry is touched by Canadian logistics. And that's not all. Canadian companies also invest heavily in Illinois. Whether it's energy infrastructure, commercial real estate, or tech startups, the north-south economic corridor between Toronto and Chicago has created thousands of jobs in finance, engineering, and logistics. Canada isn't just a partner, it's a builder and stakeholder in Illinois' future. Even the agriculture sector isn't immune to this bond. Illinois farmers rely on Canadian fertilizers, seed technologies, and trade access to reach northern markets. Grain that leaves central Illinois often ends up crossing the border to feed Canadian livestock or get processed in Canadian plants. Disrupt that link, and the consequences ripple through rural economies across the state. In 2025, the economic ecosystem that ties Illinois to Canada is more intricate and more fragile than ever. Any policy shift, border delay, or trade dispute can mean instant disruptions in production lines, shipping schedules, and local economies. So while Illinois may seem like a self-contained economic engine, the truth is simple: its gears are greased by Canadian commerce. Without that northern connection, even Chicago would start to feel the strain. Number 4. North Dakota. North Dakota, with its vast plains, powerful winds, and deep fossil fuel reserves, might seem like a self-sustaining engine of American industry. But beneath that rugged independence lies a quiet truth: North Dakota's economy is deeply entangled with Canada. Let's start with the numbers. Over 20% of North Dakota's exports go straight to Canada, making it one of the state's most critical trading partners. That includes wheat, corn, soybeans, crude oil, and refined petroleum products, staples of the state's economy. But it's not just exports. Canadian imports, particularly energy equipment, fertilizers, and manufactured components, flow in just as steadily, helping North Dakota's industries run efficiently. And when it comes to energy, the bond is even stronger. North Dakota's oil and gas fields rely heavily on cross-border infrastructure. Canadian pipelines, engineering firms, and energy technology companies are major contributors to extraction, refinement, and distribution. In many rural areas, Canadian engineers, contractors, and specialized workers are brought in to fill labor shortages, especially during peak drilling or maintenance seasons. Without this flow of skilled labor and support, production would slow or stop altogether. But that's just one part of the equation. North Dakota is also becoming a powerhouse in wind energy, and again, Canada is a key partner. Wind turbines and components often originate from Canadian factories, and grid connectivity agreements with Manitoba and Saskatchewan allow surplus renewable energy to move across the border in both directions. In an era of rising energy demand and climate concerns, this partnership is essential to ensuring North Dakota's power grid remains stable and future-ready. Now let's talk about food, and the land that produces it. North Dakota's agriculture industry, one of the most productive in the country, doesn't operate in a vacuum. Canada and North Dakota share nearly identical climates, crops, and growing cycles, which has led to deep collaboration between farmers, agribusinesses, and government agencies. Shared pest control programs, water usage agreements, grain standards, and trade protocols ensure that food production remains efficient and stable across the region. Remove Canada from that equation, and the cost of food production in North Dakota would skyrocket, not to mention disruptions to the supply chain that feeds both nations. In fact, nearly every corner of North Dakota's economy, from agriculture to energy to logistics, would feel the impact if ties with Canada were suddenly severed. In 2025, North Dakota may seem distant from global power struggles and trade wars, but it's more vulnerable than it looks. A fractured relationship with Canada wouldn't just dent its economy, it could cripple entire sectors overnight. Because while the plains may stretch endlessly, the lifeline runs north. Number 3. Minnesota. When people think of Minnesota and Canada, they might picture friendly hockey rivalries, cold winters, and beautiful lakes. But beneath the surface, there's a much more serious and strategic connection, one that ties Minnesota's energy, economy, and infrastructure directly to its northern neighbor, Manitoba. Let's start with energy. Minnesota is directly connected to Canada's hydroelectric grid, importing clean, renewable electricity from Manitoba Hydro. This energy is crucial, especially during peak demand seasons in the winter, and helps stabilize Minnesota's power supply while keeping prices more affordable. Without this Canadian electricity, Minnesota's grid would be under greater pressure, increasing the risk of brownouts or higher consumer rates. But the power relationship doesn't stop there. Minnesota is also a vital transit state for pipelines transporting Canadian crude oil. Major pipelines, including Enbridge Line 3, run straight through the state, carrying millions of barrels of oil from Alberta down to U.S. refineries. That flow helps keep gas prices down, not just in Minnesota, but across the entire Midwest. Any disruption in Canadian oil transport would be felt instantly at the pump. Now let's talk industry, particularly mining and timber. Northern Minnesota has long relied on iron ore mining and logging, and Canadian infrastructure is a major player in keeping those industries alive. Canadian rail lines, especially those operated by Canadian National, CN, and Canadian Pacific Kansas City, CPKC, connect Minnesota's mines and mills to ports on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. That means raw materials extracted in Minnesota often travel through Canada before reaching global markets. It's a two-way street, too. Canadian lumber, pulp, and industrial supplies cross into Minnesota daily, feeding mills and factories that depend on reliable, cost-effective inputs. For rural Minnesota towns, these supply chains are economic lifelines. Even tourism, often overlooked in economic discussions, shows how deeply intertwined these regions are. Canadians flock to the Twin Cities for shopping and events, while Minnesotans venture north for fishing, cabin retreats, and outdoor recreation. This cross-border tourism generates millions annually and supports small businesses on both sides of the border. But here's the bottom line. If ties with Canada were disrupted, even temporarily, Minnesota would feel it fast. Gas prices would rise, electricity reliability would falter, trade routes would jam, and mining, lumber, and energy jobs would face serious uncertainty. In 2025, Minnesota's future isn't just shaped by the Great Lakes, it's shaped by the northern border. The state's prosperity is woven tightly into a partnership with Canada that's too often overlooked, until it's tested. Because when it comes to energy and industry, Minnesota doesn't just neighbor Canada, it leans on it. So, what have we learned? These 10 US states aren't just trading with Canada, they're intertwined with it. Economically, environmentally, and even socially. In 2025, cross-border interdependence is at an all-time high. But here's the real question. Right finger, what happens if this relationship is strained by politics, tariffs, or border shutdowns? The effects would ripple through power grids, factories, grocery stores, and families. Let us know in the comments, which of these US states do you think is most dependent on Canada? Or, should Canada start relying more on someone else? Pushpin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you found it eye-opening. More powerful geopolitical content is coming your way.